welcome to Pepperdine. I'm Pete Peterson, Dean of the Graduate School of Public Policy here, and I want to welcome you to a conference which we thought, as we were going to be discussing the high cost of housing, what better place to do it than right here in Malibu, California. Today is not an ordinary academic conference because the School of Public Policy is not an ordinary academic institution. Founded 2 decades ago by the late great political scientist James Q. Wilson, the school has always sought to balance the quantitative aspects of public policy with the ones that really matter, like history and culture. Much of the work that I do is training and consulting with local government officials in how to do better public process. And one of the phrases that we use here at the policy school is that we're about putting the public back into public policy. And it's hard to think about a field of public policy that needs that better balance than the one that we're going to be exploring today, specifically housing and local economic development. To be clear, there is a real significant quantitative aspect to the decisions that are made in our communities, states, and nation as it relates to these issues. Whether we're talking about building heights or setbacks or base zoning districts or curb cutouts, these are all vital considerations. But unless we consider how these various policy considerations fit in the specific communities in which we live and work, we're going to have a very hard time making the changes that are necessary. As I mentioned before, I do a lot of consulting with communities, specifically here in California, around these issues around public process. And as we were putting together the agenda for today, I thought and saw really that we were balancing folks that are really engaged in the hard quantitative questions around these policy issues, but are also very much engaged in thinking through the more philosophical and, dare I say, community-oriented elements of this. I learned this firsthand in one of the first community engagement projects I consulted on, which was in the city of Salinas, California. This was back in 2008. And Salinas, at the time, was going through the first stages of a serious budget crisis. In fact, they were estimating that they were going to have a $20 million deficit on their $100 million general fund. And so we were brought in at the policy school to consult on a public process that was going to lead the community through a series of workshops talking about various aspects of revenue raising and possible service cuts. And in one of the sessions, in fact, the first public workshop that we hosted at the local community college, I had brought in an outside facilitator to lead a visioning process for the city, and we had about 150 community members there. And it was a specific process where people got a chance to look at what Salinas could look like in the next 5 years, depending on the decisions that they would be making today. At the end of that process, we opened up the conversation to the public, and the facilitator asked the question, okay, we're now finished with this session. It was like on a Tuesday night. I'd like to get some feedback on what you all thought about the public process you went through. And I will never forget, one of the community members raised her hand and had noted that she was a native of Salinas. She had grown up in the city. And she thought that what she had experienced over the preceding 2 hours was a great opportunity to meet neighbors she'd never met before, to learn about the various aspects of their city's budget, things that she didn't know before about tax obligations and the different responsibilities that the city had. But she said this. She said at the end of her remarks, you know, I really don't care what the city council decides as it relates to these issues. I just want a city where my daughter can come home to after she graduates high school. And I was standing next to the mayor, a guy by the name of Dennis Donahue, who's still a friend of mine to this day, and I just elbowed him right in the gut. I said, Dennis, did you hear that? And Dennis said, yeah, I heard it. The woman would like her kid to come home and live in Salinas after high school. I said, no. What you heard was what you need to tie every quantitative decision to. Because right there is the intersection between the quantitative and the narrative. It's understanding that the decisions that we make as policymakers, or the things that we teach here at the policy school, is indeed about thinking through econometrics and tax policy and all those kinds of elements, or as it relates here to planning issues, there are so many different quantitative aspects to it. But unless we're able to tie those quantitative decisions to what works in Salinas versus what works in Malibu versus what works in Athens, Georgia, or Athens, Greece, we are never, ever going to make the changes that are necessary to make. And so that's what excites me so much about the panels that we've put together here today. I think you've seen that it's a really rather interesting mix of academics and activists and policymakers and developers and people looking at this issue from so many sides. But I hope by the end of today, and we will conclude the day, as you should in Malibu, down by the pier, with, I can say this at Pepperdine, drinks. Some might be of an adult major, off campus, absolutely right, Howard. But I hope today is about putting the public back into this set of policy issues and to understand that the publics who we serve differ because they're growing up in different places. They're connected in different ways to the communities in which they live. And that really, I think, is what makes this policy school so unique, is that we are about asking those inconvenient questions about why does a policy that has all the same elements to it differ when you're looking at San Francisco versus Fresno? Because that's what James Q. Wilson taught us, is to understand the moral sense and its connection to public policy. What I'd like to do next, and I'm so excited again that we are being supported in this effort by Howard Amundsen and his Fieldstead company. Howard has a deep and long-standing relationship to not only California, but this specific set of issues as it relates to place and housing and home. And the decisions that we're making today about our own future, those decisions that relate directly to, will our kids have a California to return to? As I'm saying that, I'm thinking, I was on a radio interview just this morning, the Legislative Analyst's Office issued a report this time last year looking back over the last 10 years of California outmigration. The number one age demographic of people leaving this state from 2006 to 2016 were Californians under the age of 18. Now that didn't mean the kids were running away from home. It meant that their parents were taking them out of the state because they couldn't afford it anymore. Now there are multiple reasons to that, but certainly as we know from other surveys, housing is one of those reasons. Is California going to be a place for families? That's not a glib question. Is California going to be a home for families? And so without further ado, I'd like to first intro a video that's going to talk a little bit more about Howard's connection to this issue, and then welcome up Howard Amundsen to give our introductory remarks. So thank you so much for coming.
Here today because in Los Angeles and indeed in many communities across the country, there is a crisis in affordable housing. So Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and other founding fathers believed that if the American experiment was going to work, the vast majority of citizens would need to be independent, land-holding farmers. They believed that as property owners, they would have a heightened self-interest in the government's policies, and this interest would make them what we would today call engaged citizens.
The best way to make housing affordable is to have a lot more of it, right? We don't have affordable cars. We don't build affordable cars. Cars are affordable because you get old cars.
One of the things we're looking at is the amount of redundant retail space. We're going to have enormous amounts of this. And the great thing about it is it's not in anybody's neighborhood. It's not, not in their backyard. It already has parking. It already has traffic, so it's not going to create more traffic. It already has water. It already has power.
It's the entitlement process we described, like to get your housing proposal approved, is incredibly convoluted, expensive, and it's discretionary. So even if you abide by all the local rules, they can still say no to your housing. I mean, I would argue this is a fundamental rule of law problem.
You should get a permit, right? So this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. It shouldn't be negotiable. When it's negotiable, it's corrupted.
If you consult the political science department, they'll give you lots of stories about interest groups, about labor unions, about organized activity that's, I think, is perfectly applicable at the national and even the state level, but it doesn't work at the local level at all. You can't tell a Republican from a Democrat at a zoning hearing.
It is a story of individuals, and the left makes that mistake when they don't pay enough attention to individual choice, but the right makes a mistake when they ignore all the public policies that make it possible for people to realize their dreams.
Instead of talking about rights, we need to talk about people's interests. And what about the rights and interests of people who need housing in your community?
Housing costs are probably one of the most important critical links to achieving the American dream.
We're at that point where we're not going to solve our problems by tweaking our institutions. They're going to fail. They're going to fail on a really big scale. And we're going to have no choice but to pick up the pieces and try something new.
Formulate a few remarks. I am no businessman, and I've had to work hard to try to figure out how to understand things that he just understood implicitly. But I mean, I'm proud to have had that conference. But I spent all this money on it. But I'm pretty sure I know what Howard Senior would have done. He would have said, "Screw it, and go back to Omaha," given the current situation. This is really a star-studded gathering. I recognize so many, names from the internet, and that invention of the devil, the internet, has made it possible for people to start really reading and having access to a lot of readings on urbanism, local land use, and all that kind of stuff that were very difficult to access before, and so I guess it has become one of my vices to surf these sites. I mean, when we lay out, and I'm not sure where our urbanist walk of fame with stars on the ground. A lot of the people in this room will have stars. I don't know where we should do this. It's also interesting beyond the Pepperdine campus. The only other time I was ever here was for a guitar competition of all things, a classic guitar competition, which a very different subject from this, except I told them to tell Christopher Parkin if they ever want any more money from me on this, for anything at Pepperdine, they have to make Christopher Parkin do the late Dale Memorial acoustic tribute album. And I think, and I see a lot of people from back east, and yes, back east here includes Brainerd, Minnesota. I can assure you, we spoke of Omaha as back east in the olden days, and if you don't if you don't know who Dick Dale was, I'm sorry for you, but I don't have time to explain it. In any, it's wonderful to see all of you, and I bid you all welcome. I'm looking forward to a great conference. Thank you.
So we begin. I was asked by a few people before we got started, have you done other conferences on this subject before? And turns out the last conference we did on housing was about 7 years ago, right in this auditorium. It was in partnership with our friends at the law school and was looking at some issues around sustainable development. And I'll never forget, I was moderating a panel on public engagement and the role of the public in planning decisions. And we had at the time the director of LA City Planning, a woman by the name of Gail Goldberg. And I asked Gail, what is, when you think about the planning decisions your city has to make and your department has to make, what is the role of the public in making those decisions? And she said, and this is a direct quotation, it's been burned into my memory. She said, you know, Pete, we at the planning department, we always put people up in front of the public who are the least prepared to be there. And what she meant by that was not that her planners did not have expertise in the building heights and setbacks and all the things they teach at USC. But what they didn't know was, what is the connection between those very important aspects and the public that you're serving? And have you actually built into your process the ability to actually learn from the public? And have you done that early enough that when it's time to do something called the public workshop, you haven't baked the cake already? That there's actually something you can learn from them. As much as your expertise is helpful and necessary, have you built in that opportunity to learn from your community? And that's why I'm so excited that we're opening this conference with a keynote from Chuck Marohn. Chuck, as many of you know, is the president and founder of Strong Towns. And as I've seen other speeches Chuck has given, he is quite open about the fact that he is as surprised that Strong Towns has grown into this national movement. He's as surprised as anybody is. But I think what you'll hear again this morning is his ability to really tie these concepts that are, at one sense, so technical, but also so very personal. You know, I have to say that we invite controversial speakers here on a regular basis. It's one of the great public services that we offer to the community. And I have to say, in the Facebook advertising that we did for this particular conference, I have never seen the vitriol in the comments that came forth in announcing this conference. It was, you know, Pepperdine, you're a bunch of stooges representing developers. You have no idea what is happening here in California. I think there was a phrase, the Manhattanization of California. That's what this conference was supposed to be about. And again, what's so great about Chuck being here is he's really able to take that engineer's brain, which he has, but also to connect it with the real personal decisions that are made in our community. So I have to say, before I bring him up, Chuck, as many of you might know, has a forthcoming book that I can't wait to not only read, but welcome you back here to talk specifically on that book, Chuck. It's titled Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity, which seems perfectly fitted not only for this time in our nation, but also this time in California. So please join me in welcoming the president and founder of Strong Towns, Chuck Marohn.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. I'm going to start off by just saying that as a Minnesotan, I'm predisposed to love California. When I left home, it was in the 30s, and of course it's gorgeous here all the time. I was thinking my family vacation patterns. My daughter's 14, my oldest daughter, and I counted today. We've been on 5 family spring break vacations with her here. which kind of gives you a percentage of how nice it is to come someplace warm and inviting. The talk that I'm going to give today, I was asked to state the problem, which my wife laughed to no end about. She's like, "That's all you do is bitch about the problems." She's like, "They know what they're doing. They're inviting you to do." So as like an engineer, a planner, and a critic of the way things are, someone who struggles with the way we have built our cities, this is one of those things where I could like literally take the whole day and go over this, and it wouldn't be healthy for you or for me to do that. There's this other part of me, though, that as I was preparing these remarks and thinking about what I wanted to share, was very cognizant of the fact that the Minnesota part of me just said, I'm going to your house. I'm going to your house to tell you what's wrong with your drapes and your furniture and your paint selection. And it didn't sit right with me. I kind of had a little bit of a second take on how I was going to do this. So I want to start with a kind of back and forth acknowledgement of where we're at. I find California to be the most incoherent state in that I've ever been to. No, it's not an applause thing. I find myself, it's one of these things where when we've come here, when I've come here professionally, when I've come here as a visitor and a guest and a tourist and what have you, oftentimes our family conversations are, would you ever live here? Would you ever move here? And there's as you're sitting on the beach, as you're enjoying good food, as you're enjoying nice weather, my kids are like, why wouldn't we live here? Why wouldn't we live here? And I just felt like I could never live here. And I could never live here because the internal day-to-day cognitive dissonance is overwhelming to me. And I struggle with it. I'm saying this in like a kind, gentle, respectful way. I find this place to be very incoherent. I'm going to give you an example of this that I had. You have these weird gas pumps. And I know you have a reason for this. I looked it up. You're trying to deal with smog and emissions and what have you. One night, I'm sitting at a gas station. My hungry family's in the car. We've got to get somewhere. I'm out of gas. I'm trying to figure out how to make this dang thing work. In Minnesota, you just flip the switch and put it in and it goes and it fills up. Here you've got to hold it a certain way and like dance and stuff. And it's really strange to me. And as I'm trying to figure this all out, respecting, the fact that you're trying to fight smog and trying to keep, pollution from happening and honoring that and doing the things you ask me to do, I stare across the street and I see a line of 16 cars at the In-N-Out Burger. And I ask, like, what are you trying to tell me? Like, what are you trying to say to me here? It seems rather incoherent, right? It seems rather incoherent. I struggle to understand it. Here's my olive branch. This was our governor for a while. We elected a wrestler, a professional wrestler, and not the kind that actually wrestles, the kind that does theater wrestling. We elected him our governor. So I'm not saying that you have a monopoly on incoherence, right? It's a shared thing. But we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the struggles here. Early on in Strong Towns, I got when we first started the organization, we had a nonprofit, we had a foundation that came to us and said, "You're doing really important work." They gave us 3 years of startup money, and the only thing they asked us to do was to go out and share our message with as many places as possible. And so I started to travel around Minnesota, meetings with 2 people and 3 people. Any place we could get a couple people together, I would go and share like the core Strong Towns message. Eventually that became the Midwest, the Dakotas, Wisconsin, a little bit in Iowa. And then I got invited to come speak once in California. It was my first really out of kind of the middle of the country talk. And we wound up scheduling 11 talks in 5 days. I started in Reading and I ended in San Diego. So to give you a sense of the ground we covered, sleeping on couches and eating In-N-Out Burger, just to make ends meet and try to share this message with as many places as I could. That was in 2012. The response was overwhelming. I mean, we had huge crowds. We had very enthusiastic conversations. There was a lot of back and forth. But something very strange happened that I had not been subjected to in the Midwest. Every time I gave a talk, I would get to the end, and my talks were generally, here's the problem that we're struggling with, here's why our cities are going broke, here's what we have to think about differently when we approach these problems. I would get to the end, and some Californian would stand up, angry at me, and demand a set of solutions. Demand a 5-point plan or a 3-point plan. And I'll paraphrase exactly, I'll paraphrase what was said. Chuck, you've come here, you've scared the hell out of us. You didn't offer us a solution. What is the solution to these problems? And you heard Johnny in the video here. Johnny was the last speaker. Johnny said in his Johnny kind of way, there's no solution. Like, this ship is going down and you're gonna have to rebuild something. And I'm not gonna say it the way Johnny said it. I mean, that's Johnny's very provocative way. But I'm gonna start this dialogue with you by just suggesting maybe there are no solutions. And by that, I'm going to interpret the way that I hear California speak, because it's a little bit different than Minnesota speak. What I came to understand here is that a solution in California nomenclature is something someone else can change about what they're doing so that nothing has to change about what you're doing. I don't think we have any of those. I don't think we have any of those left. I think we have to open our minds to the fact that that type of approach is actually a big part of the problem. And when I ran into over and over and over again Californians demanding from me a set of solutions, that was like one of the things that was most incoherent to me. How can you solve what are really deep existential block level problems with some set of 1 or 2 or 3 macro solutions? So let's step back and think about where we're at today. And I think kind of the derivation of some of this incoherence. When we look at understand is that the post-World War II development pattern really is a function of the further west you go and the further south you go. When we go north and we go east, we had, just because of the time that it was settled, very coherent development patterns that reflect kind of thousands of years of human settlement. Here's the way we built cities around the world for thousands of years. As we go further west and as we go further south, what we are talking about is a uniquely American approach, an experimental approach, a new approach to building that took off really in the early 1900s and then accelerated after World War II. One of the byproducts of this, of course, is congestion. And when we look at surveys of Californians, housing prices have risen in this list, but not as high as traffic congestion. If we ask Californians, what are the major problems? Climate change is not high on that list. Housing affordability is climbing up, but not for people who own homes because they like housing prices going up. It's traffic congestion. We can go to any city in California and they will have on their books a transportation plan that includes the hierarchical road network. Local streets going into collector streets going into arterial streets. This is the kind of foundational building block of that, the further south, the further west you go kind of development pattern. When we go east, northeast, you don't see this as much, but in this part of the country, it's ubiquitous. Everybody has this. I want you to think back to your kind of Ecology 101 training and think of a river network in a, small streams flow into small rivers flow into larger rivers, flow into major tributaries. We understand how this kind of system works. We understand that when rain happens out on the edge, if that rain is intense enough or persistent enough that we will eventually at those major tributaries get flooding. We understand this so well, in fact, what have we done from a public policy standpoint? We've gone out to the edge and we've said, you know, that ditch, that wetland area, that parking lot, you've got to store that stormwater here. You can't release that downstream, because even though it's not that big of an effect right here, cumulatively it has this massive, massive effect. Now think of a river of a different type, right? Think of a river network of asphalt and concrete. Why, when we get rain out on the edge, are we so shocked and confounded by the flooding that we get? Why does this elude us? And we know we get a little bit of money from that stuff that we build out there, but we know that this costs enormous, enormous sums. Why is this confounding to us? Why do we struggle day after day to reconcile this? It's not that difficult. If we set out as Californians to create a system that manufactured the maximum amount of congestion possible, this is what it would look like. This is what it would look like. We have created a congestion manufacturing machine. And of course, if we want to deal with this, in California, what do? We widen highways, we add more lanes, we add more capacity. We come up with big silver bullet projects, like we're going to have high-speed rail from here to here, and we'll solve, deal with congestion. How do we deal with in an ecological standpoint? Well, we go out here on the edge and we retain the flooding, right? We hold things back. We, in a sense, take the trips that would happen on the system and we make them local trips, right? In California, this is one of many projects, but this one got to be kind of high profile. The widening of Highway 91, one of the most congested freeways in the country. I had to laugh in lieu of crying when I read the local paper that reported on it. The project will give some relief to drivers in the regular lanes, raising their average rush hour speeds from 8 miles an hour to 9.4 miles an hour. $1.4 billion, right? It's hard to fathom the level of beating your head against the wall that represents, right? At what point do we start to reconcile this cognitive dissonance that we have? You've seen these before in different places. I plucked this one from Fresno. We all understand this development pattern over time, how cities, grew in one way and then all of a sudden started to grow in another way. This is that the further you go west, further you go south phenomena. We've seen this and we understand this. And I think the thing is that we've accepted this as California, as the way that we build. We've accepted this as sense, the DNA of this place. This is the structure and the character of how we do things. I want to help you question that, because there's some inherent assumptions with that I think we've not really dealt with. The first one is this concept of building all at once to a finished state. When we build a development today, and you have to appreciate the amount of hubris, and I'm going to use a word, and I don't mean to be this harsh, but the amount of narcissism involved in believing that when you build something, it is now done. We are the first culture in all of human history to build things to a finished state, to build things and have an assumption built in to our very existence that this thing from this point forward is perfected and will never change. We build a neighborhood of single-family homes, and world without end, that will be single-family homes forevermore, right? That is what we build. This is not how human civilizations were ever built in the past. Human civilizations were always a messy collection of starting very small and iteratively working to the next step. Starting with a small little box, and over time, as people came together in a place, and as land values continued to climb and kind of force a certain redevelopment pressure naturally in place, we would see places evolve to the next level of intensity. And as this process continued, you would evolve to the next level of intensity. I want to go back to this photo here and talk a little bit about this so we can kind of crystallize in our minds the conundrum that we've created for ourselves by building all at once to a finished state. When we go out and we build a brand new housing subdivision, this is the place where the affluent live, right? Or depending on the price point, you know, we'll separate price points, but these are like the nicer new homes. These are places that generally when we build, we're building for a middle class, the upper middle class, for wealthier people. It's important to recognize what's going on though. By locking things in all at once to a finished state and building them, you know, in this very short period of time, what happens is an echo effect. 25 years later, 30 years later, everybody's roof in this entire development will fail at the same time. Everybody's driveway is going to go bad at the same time. Everybody's house, their siding, if they had siding that needed to be painted, it would all go bad at the same time. Everybody's vinyl siding is going to fail at the same exact time. Everybody's appliances are all going to go bad at the same time. So by building all at once, everything within a development all at once, and then locking it in, you're not going to change. What happens is, after a generation of like visual prosperity, the entire neighborhood all at once goes into distress. What happens in that kind of a scenario? The affluent, the people with means, who pick up on the visual cues, they do what? They move to the next subdivision. And in kind of a slash and burn agriculture kind of way, they move on. And behind them, they leave a place that is financially stressed. In the past, what would happen to a place that was financially stressed? You would see an evolution of that place. The reason that place exists is because the land had value. The land values create a need for a place. What you would see is people starting to adapt. Let me give you an example. I have a house, the roof needs to be fixed. I don't have the money to fix the roof. Instead of letting the roof go bad, what I'm going to do is go get a loan for the roof, and I'm also going to get a loan to do an addition on the back. And the addition on the back, I'm going to make an apartment, and I'm going to rent that apartment out, and I'm going to use that cash flow to pay back the loan. That's a very standard way that human beings for thousands of years made ends meet, right? I'm going to have a home business and have that in the front of my house. You know, create here on this lot a little commercial enterprise to go with my residential. I'm going to rent out the second story. I'm going to convert it into a bed and breakfast. In other words, places evolved in place to respond to the stresses of the market. We don't allow that anymore. That's all gone. If you're a single-family neighborhood, you will forever be a single-family neighborhood. If you're a duplex neighborhood, you'll forever be a duplex neighborhood. If you're an apartment, you're going to be an apartment until it completely falls apart. And then we'll go get some tax subsidy to get it torn down and rebuilt. This is one of the reasons why you had this crazy redevelopment agency process. This kind of unelected side government that could take on huge amounts of debt to come in and bulldoze entire neighborhoods in ways that we've known since the 60s are wretched for people. Come in and bulldoze it and put something new back, because we have no mechanism today for succession. We have no mechanism to envision something changing over time. This is the way humans built places for thousands of years. They built them starting out very small and ending up very big. And one of the important actualizations of this is to grasp that cities started as little pop-up shacks like this. But when they would go to the next iteration, what were you going to find a couple blocks each way of this street? You're going to find stuff that looked like that. What is that? You have all kinds of things in the state for affordable housing, all kinds of programs. You're talking about more. How do we subsidize rent? How do we require inclusionary zoning? How do we do all these things in a paradigm of building all at once to a finished state? How did people for thousands of years handle poor people? Let me say it in two ways, because I don't want to sugarcoat it, because it wasn't always good. But poor people generally started out in places like this. Low bar of entry, very small box, very affordable to get into. Were these places great? No. What was the promise you got from a place like this? The promise you got is that if a lot of people came together and made these small investments, that the land underneath would start to have value. It would grow, it would rise up, it would increase. And when the land underneath increases in actual real value, not the kind of fake financialized value, but real underlying value because there's a place there, what would happen is a natural redevelopment pressure would occur. When a land becomes more valuable and there's a really cheap house on it, what happens? You guys see this today because you've artificially created these things. You get scrape-offs and you get big mansions in really valuable places, right? Yeah. This was the natural mechanism for someone to start with nothing and end up with something. Because you could get in very cheap, and as the land values went up, you could get your money back, you could put more money in, you built wealth in place. The downside of this, when you get to a place like this, you've got this out on the edge. As long as the city continues to grow incrementally, the people who are upstarts, the people who share in that prosperity. The downside is when you get to a stasis, what happens? You have what you see in cities today, like Paris, London, where the center is wealthy and exclusive, and the edge we sometimes call slums. If you look at the North American development pattern, I'm gonna say this, I want you to visualize this. This is a very coarse way to describe a very fine-grained, fluid situation. Cities, historically, were always wealthy people surrounded by poor people. That's what cities were for thousands and thousands of years. And that was not always, I mean, there are many instances where that was wholly despotic, and I'm not standing here defending that relationship. But the one thing that occurred in North America was that when you started out with a city like this and the city grew, the people who started with nothing grew to have something along with that. That was part of the deal. The problem is when the city gets to a certain point where it stops incrementally expanding out, those opportunities go away. When the land values aren't going up, when redevelopment is not happening, the people who started with nothing don't share in the wealth. What we've overlaid here in the United States is not only a development pattern that, in a sense, inverted our cities from wealthy people surrounded by poor people to poor people surrounded by wealthy people. We spent trillions of dollars inverting that system. We also stagnated the upper mobility part of it, so that you are no longer able to start with nothing and have a natural mechanism to end up with something. In California, you see this acutely. This North American development pattern has a particular characteristic that goes along with this echo that is pernicious, particularly for local governments. This is a cash flow diagram of development. We've modeled many, many, many new developments and looked at the long-term cash flow implications of them. What we see is that when new, we can just think of it as new suburban development comes in, it has a very definite cash flow profile for the city. We have become very good at getting developers to pay for infrastructure, getting those costs rolled over into the mortgages and what have you. We've become very good at local governments in collecting fees and essentially getting the first life cycle of new development paid for by someone other than the local government. What this means is that for a generation, the development is cash flow positive for the public. When we look at a new development that comes in, they pay taxes every year. If we take that money and we set it aside, what we see is that there's a cumulative amount of money that comes in. A 5-year-old street doesn't cost you anything. A 10-year-old sidewalk isn't costing you anything. A 20-year-old pipe isn't costing you anything. And so from a government standpoint, in terms of the infrastructure, it is incredibly cash flow positive. The problem comes in when a generation later you have to go out and fix stuff. You have to go out and fix that road. You have to go out and fix that sidewalk. And you look and you say, where's the tax base to do that? What you find is that the cumulative amount of money you brought in from the development is not enough. And you go cash flow negative. The way we solve that fundamental insolvency problem is what? We grow more. No, we raise taxes, yes, but raise taxes in a different way. What we do, the solution to our problems, especially here in California, is more growth. The more we can grow, the more we can, in a sense, bring in that good, easy cash flow and use that cash to make good on all the prior promises we've made. This is that same single development modeled over and over and over again. And what you see is that when you do growth over and over and over again, that Fresno-style growth I showed you, when you do that over and over and over again, what you have is you have this huge impouring of revenue. You have a lot of money coming in. You're feeling very rich, very wealthy. This is why cities that are growing very quick seem like they're very successful. They're very affluent. For decades, they are. But as they grow, they're taking on all these liabilities. We will maintain all that road. We'll maintain all that pipe. We'll fix those pumps. We'll do all that stuff. And when those start to come due, yeah, you got to spend some money, but you're having all this growth. The growth covers up, from a cash flow standpoint, so much of the hardship until you go further out in time. And then it starts to accumulate and accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. California's growth, kind of binge after World War II, go west, first state to have this real massive horizontal expansion to your development patterns. Again, it's that further you go west, further you go south, the more this is a dominant feature of the landscape. What we did is we created a situation where California could grow very quickly, very prosperous. All the outward signs where this is the land of milk and honey. But we were creating liabilities after liabilities after liabilities. And let me just put this on a timeline for you. Here's about where you adopted CEQA, right? Why did you do that? Because of all the environmental impacts of this, right? Here's where you adopted Prop 13. Why? Someone said we raised taxes. That's why, because we were raising taxes. Because all of a sudden things started to come due we had to pay for. So we say, well, we don't want to pay for that. That's crazy. So we put that in place, right? Cities started to take on enormous amounts of debt. And to keep it all going, what did we have to do? We had to, oh yeah, I forgot about this one. We talk about pensions in this state in such a weird way. I don't think anybody quite remembers what this conversation was. And I'm going to say this, I'm going to say that the pension crisis is morally ambiguous today if we look at the history. And I hope that doesn't offend people. I'm not trying to offend. I'm trying to kind of help you frame this conversation. Back in the 80s, when cities were in this struggle, we have all this stuff we have to do. We don't have the money to do it. They went to their employees and said, hey, if you sacrifice today, we can balance our budget and we can invest in growth. And then we'll give you larger pensions in the future. And the public employees said, okay, we'll go for that. That was a bad deal for everybody because that growth didn't make us wealthier. There's always one. No, it's mine. There's always one person who said, so what do you do? It would be like if, it would be like if I went to my daughter and said, like, I'm not going to save for your college. I'm going to take that money, I'm going to invest it in, Bitcoin. And she's like, oh, that sounds great, Dad. And I'm like, yeah, because when you get to college, we'll have tons of money. And then Bitcoin blows up and we are broke. Who screwed that up, right? I mean, I did. She maybe did, agreeing to it. Like, this is a bad deal, right? Who's responsible now? That's why I say it's morally ambiguous. It's a disaster. I'm not saying it's a good situation, but understand, like, that was one of the ways we tried to make this thing work. And then, of course, we created this huge bubble to try to extend this a little bit further. I want to show you some of the trade-offs we've made with this development pattern. These are two identical blocks, the one on the left and the one on the right are the same size, the same area, they have the same amount of public infrastructure. The stuff that's built on them is different. The way they've been constructed is different. The one on the left is that traditional development pattern. In the 1920s, this was the far edge of town. What you're looking at here is that first iteration of the traditional development pattern, that first iteration of where you could start with nothing and end up with something. These were going to be the upstarts, the poor people out on the edge of town. And had things continued as they had for thousands of years, what would have ultimately happened here is that the city would continue to grow. These properties would become more valuable. There would have been a redevelopment of them. They would have got second and third stories. They would have become more intense, more ornate. Wealth would have grown in these locations. Of course, that's not what happened. After these were built, we had the Depression, we had World War II, and now we have a new development pattern that skips right over this and starts building in a hyper-horizontal way out on the edge. These blocks have stagnated for almost 100 years. The one on the right used to look like the one on the left, but it was torn down and a new kind of modern auto-oriented style of development put in its place. The In-N-Out burger of the Midwest, right? This is their version of that kind of building. Everybody felt this was really successful. Everybody felt we got rid of blight. We've got something now new. This is all great. Nobody bothered to notice that the value of the lot on the left is significantly more than the one on the right. Not even close. Not even close. The pattern of development that we become used to growing in is not only this kind of illusion of wealth creating, financial sugar high inducing pattern where we grow and we get the cash now and we take on these long-term liabilities. But financially, it is far less productive. Oh, you want to dim that a little bit? That's fine. You don't. That's the least important part of this. Yeah, that gives you a little bit. That's good because I'm going to show you some maps now too. A good friend of mine named Joe Minicozy does financial modeling, and he gave me some of his California models to share with you. One of my favorites is this Redlands Mall. Here's the property that the mall was on. This was completely torn down. Everything was purchased, bought up, destroyed to make way for the mall. Joe looked at this and said, we've got the maps of what was there. What if we just put back what was there as if it had never gotten torn down? So they looked around the community and said, what's the equivalent kind of building type that was there, and what's that worth today? And what they found out was if they had kept the buildings, in other words, never done the redevelopment, just kept the old kind of rundown buildings that were destroyed, you'd have over 3 times the property value there today. Today the mall's worth $5.6 million. The equivalent stuff is worth $21 million. Our development pattern, again, I'm going to say this a couple more times, exchanges near-term cash flow for long-term liabilities. It is a lower step in financial productivity. It creates for us this situation where we're actually spending more and getting less back. Here's a 3-dimensional map of Redlands. What you're looking at here is value per acre. Think about a farmer growing a crop in a field. The parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, that have the most bushels per acre, that's the most productive part of the farm field. What Joe's showing you here is where's the most financially productive part of the city? Where do we get the most value per acre? Modeled hundreds of cities across the country. The pattern is the same over and over and over again. where we've got those traditional, incrementally built, walkable neighborhoods, the stuff that was built pre-Depression, pre-World War II, that's the stuff that spikes. That's the stuff where you have high value per acre. The stuff that we built post-World War II, the stuff that's spread out, the stuff that's denuded, the In-N-Out Burger, the taco place, the mall, those places have incredibly high costs and very low financial productivity. Here's a Lancaster, Davis. I could go through about 30 of these over and over. It's the same pattern again and again and again. Here's the implication for you in California. To start with that map I began at the beginning, the further west you go, the further south you go, this pattern becomes a larger percentage of your built environment. When we model cities in the Northeast, what we see is that there's a large part of them that financially are coherent. They were built at a time when they were required to be. We have built this state on a completely different model. And financially, none of it pencils out. None of it pencils out. Here's the roads in Lancaster, California. So this is the mile of roads that, or the feet of road, excuse me, that were built every single year up to 2014. We just plotted them up on a map. It's one of these kind of baffling things to me as an engineer, that for some reason we can't realize that a road we built here is going to have to be maintained here, right? Like, it's pretty obvious when you build something, you know that the city, unless the world blows up and we're not going to maintain roads anymore, that it becomes this infinite obligation that repeats over and over again on a cycle that's pretty predictable. And when we build more roads, that is going to be added. When you look at this as a system, what you see is that the more we build, the more our liabilities grow. We had this spurt of growth right after World War II. Like, now we got to maintain this stuff. What do? We induce more growth to pay for that. Then what happens? We get more here. It's in a sense like a tsunami, that generation after generation, the liability just grows and grows and grows. Our reaction to our insolvency is to build more insolvent places. That doesn't make sense. I want to do an interactive thing here. So I want you to actually, we don't do these things in Minnesota because we don't talk in public. But I think you guys will do it here. Economists have pretty much uniformly come up with a term for what happened in housing between 2001 and 2008. I want us all to speak this term out loud. 2001 to 2008 was a housing, there we go. Okay? And we're all very comfortable saying that, right? Like, we all concur, we agree this was a housing bubble. We can talk about all the reasons why it was created. There are many, many books. There's a great book called And Then the Roof Caved In that I think is the best systematic going through of what happened. It starts with appraisers and realtors and ends up on Wall Street. And it says this wasn't like one failure. It was a system of things that came together, like-minded people with like-minded things, not working in coordination, but working in their own interests, created this massive housing bubble. I talked to people, many, many people in California, public officials, people in real estate. What were things like in 2009, 2010? They said it was apocalypse. It was horrible. The world was coming to an end. We didn't know how to deal with it. Okay. We're all on the same page here, right? We all have the same description of history. All right. 2011 then to 2017. Please, everybody at the same time. Housing, right. So we created a condition we called a bubble, the bursting of which was an apocalypse for us. And now we have recovered to a bubble I'm walking you through this, right? Does this make any sense to you? Throughout history, when we look at housing to income ratios, particularly when we look post-Depression, when the housing market changed fundamentally because of some federal interventions. And let me not gloss over that. I think I'm doing okay on time. Let me not gloss over that. Before the Great Depression, if you had a house, your house was financed by a local bank. We all remember like the Jimmy Stewart, your money's in his house and all that. Banks did not do 30-year mortgages, right? The risk was too great. If you were like a local bank with, Thelma and Martha's money there that she would come and get back, you couldn't do a 30-year mortgage. You would do 3-year, 5-year, maybe 7-year balloons. So you might finance it over a longer period of time to keep the payments down, but you would have a balloon. And the reason you would do that is because you couldn't take the interest rate risk. If interest rates changed, if the market changed, you as a bank had to be able to, every 3 to 5 years, say, let's reevaluate this. Well, that's great for a local economic ecosystem. You can get people into homes, it works. It stops working when housing prices collapse. Because if you are able to make your payments and everything's going along great, but all of a sudden your housing price drops in half, and you get to the end of that balloon and you've got to refinance, and the bank says, instead of loaning you $200,000, your house is not only worth $100,000, but you owe $180,000, you have to come up with $80,000 in cash in a Great Depression. I'm using modern numbers for back then. No one could do it. And so what was happening is that people who could pay for their houses were getting kicked out of their homes for no good reason. This is Keynes's paradox of thrift, paradox of thrift. So what happened is that the federal government actually stepped in and said, look, extend these mortgages out, we'll insure them for 30 years, let people stay in their homes, let them continue to make payments, we'll make sure you don't lose money, local banks, and ultimately we'll create a secondary market where this paper can go. I think you can make a strong case that was not only a fundamental shift in the market, but a kind of like the only compassionate thing we were going to do at the time that was going to keep people in their homes. You can have a very libertarian view, which I understand and respect, that the market eventually would have corrected. Yes, we would have kicked everybody out of their homes. There would have been social revolution and unrest, and eventually housing would have got divided back up amongst people, and we would have figured it out, and humanity would have gone on. I think in the context of the time, I've come to maybe have a little bit more respect for why we did that particular intervention. So from that point forward, what we see is that housing price to income ratio, so the amount you would pay for a house versus the amount of income you have, would fluctuate pretty consistently between 2 and 3. You would pay double the amount to triple the amount for a house as you would have annual income. And those ratios would bounce back and forth. There's kind of a pendulum to it. When it would get too high, it would overcorrect back down and it would move. But 2.6 is considered like a healthy ratio. Here's where you're at today in your major cities. I think we can all talk about the reasons, and I know today we're going to talk about, there's going to be debates about, do we build more? Yes. How do we build? I don't know. Do we subsidize this? Do we reduce that? What do we do? The reality is, for whatever your causal vector is, and I think there are many, many, many causal vectors, this is way out of whack. And in general, and there are some exceptions to this, but I'm going to suggest that I don't think this is one. In general, when people say this time is different, something has fundamentally changed, something is radically different from now to this point forward, that is rarely the case. And it's rarely the case in something as basic as the places we live in. This does not feel like something that will be sustained. And if it will not be sustained, what happens? We're back to Johnny's quote, right? If we create a housing bubble, the bubble bursts, we have apocalypse. We create a housing recovery, which is like a rebranding of, a bigger bubble. when that bursts, what happens? Here's the thing that anybody who wants to talk about affordable housing has to wrestle with. And this is like a fundamental truth that we don't often speak, right? Who benefits from high housing prices? Well, let's see. Local governments benefit from them, have a greater tax base. The state government, the federal government, they all benefit from the wealth effect and what have you. Existing homeowners, do you think they want high housing prices or low housing prices? Yeah, people selling would like really high housing prices, right? Banks and insurance companies, they benefit from having housing prices continuing to climb. Makes their job a lot easier. They can be a lot sloppier in what they do. If, you know, you have this effect where if housing prices are going to increase 5, 7, 8, 10, 20% every year, you don't have to be really a stickler about what you do, right? It's kind of like a forgiving system. Every mistake you make will be covered up by appreciation, right? Land speculators like it, realtors, pension funds. Who doesn't like high housing prices? Well, these two huge constituencies, right? The renters and the poor. And employers, when they're not homeowners. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think you could put them in, you know, you could, minorities are spread through these different categories, right? If we're going to have a serious conversation about housing prices and housing affordability, I think we have to acknowledge that almost every single person involved in a high-level decision-making capacity in that conversation has enormous incentives to want housing prices to be high. It's one of these things, and I'm going to say this as an engineer. Within the engineering profession, there were all kinds of times where we would recommend certain projects. We would recommend certain things. And I would go there with a straight face, believing in my heart that this was like the best thing to do. It was only years later that I looked back and I said, you know, was widening that road really the smartest thing to do? Was running that pipe out to the middle of nowhere really the best thing to do? I've believed it at the time, I sincerely did. But you know what I was lacking at the time was any kind of incentive to question my own assumptions. That's what's missing here. That's what I want to point out. When I talk to people in California, I say, what was it like in 2009, 10? They say apocalypse. And then in the next breath, they say housing is unaffordable. I said, well, there's one way to deal with housing affordability. We do policies that lower housing prices. Well, that would be what? Apocalypse, yeah. So you have this conundrum. If you really want to deal with this problem, you have this internal incentive tension. There's one little exception to this, and I want to talk about local governments just quickly. You have this great thing called Prop 13, right? And Prop 13 has this really perverse incentive of making governments unequal partners in the wealth that is being produced within the community. So if I take steps to, if I'm the city of what have you, and I take steps to improve the value of my corporation, the corporate boundaries of my city, people in the city grow wealthy, the property becomes more valuable. What happens is that nothing. I have a certain amount that my tax will go up. I have a certain amount that my valuation will go up. And it doesn't really have a direct feedback loop. It's a very, very long feedback loop. What's a short feedback loop for cities? Well, if I can rip down a neighborhood and put in an auto dealership, that's a pretty quick feedback loop. If I can get the regional mall or the new growth out on the edge or the shopping center, I get all those. That's growth that I get a lot of tax revenue from. If I can increase your neighborhood property by 20% by doing something really great in the neighborhood that makes your standard of living better, your quality of life better, everything, if I can take and say, well, this neighborhood of single family homes can have duplexes now, which are going to, affect the way people are able to manage their own finances in this complex system we built and also raise the value of this neighborhood, no credit for that, nothing. But if I go out on the edge and I build a new housing development, I build a new set of strip malls, I put in an auto dealership, I get huge amounts of revenue from that. You've created a system that puts every incentive in place to do the most short-term destructive thing financially. Now we've got this debate. There's a lot of people in this room who I've had this debate with, who I'm on opposite sides of, because I'm not a big fan of this approach. How do we go in at the state level, look at all these problems, and come up with one, again, grand solution to solve them all? Well, I know what we do. Let's make all the land that looks like this behave in a certain way, everywhere, all at once. California, to me, feels like a car that's hit ice, that skids from one side to the other, correcting and overcorrecting and overcorrecting and overcorrecting from the top down. It is. But I think you get it, right? Yes, I do. I married one. My job was to set the stage and talk about the problem. I do want to give you a couple little things to think about to hopefully frame some of this conversation. Every time I get deep into a one-on-one conversation with a Californian about any of these problems, and we start to kind of delve into them and pull them apart and talk about the nuance, particularly at the local level about them, the feedback that I get, the conversation ending point is, this is California, we're going to grow. I understand that. This is a gorgeous state. When it is 40 below in Minnesota, and I look at San Diego and it's 72 and sunny, damn you all, right? Like there's a really convincing case to be made that as long as there is land in California, people will move here. And I get that. I get that. This is California, we're always going to grow. And what's inherent, the subtext of that statement is that the growth is going to cover up whatever problems we have. We're going to be able to deal with whatever problems we have, because if we can just continue to grow, we'll have wealth, we'll have money, we'll have stuff, and we'll be able to take care of things. What if growth is a problem? I want you to think about, I want you to struggle with that tonight, tomorrow, in the coming days. And not growth per se, because growth is a net positive. When we can grow our economy, when we can grow, we provide more opportunity, we provide more innovation. Growth is good. But is this pattern of growth good? Is this way of growing good? Is this way of growing making us wealthier, making us more prosperous, creating for us better places, better lives? Or is this just giving us a trade-off that we are increasingly becoming oppressed by? So let's go back to the question that I was haranguing. What's the solution, Chuck? Give us the solution. Tell us what someone else can change about what they do so that I don't have to change anything about what I do. What is this? I want to give you two things to think about. The first one is that we have to lower the bar of entry. I think California is one of the worst states in the union for raising the bar of entry for compassionate reasons. It is, Wendell Berry said in farming, if you care about the poor, you have to allow subsistence farming. And subsistence of farming offends us. As affluent people, it's abhorrent to us that someone would be marginally, in a marginal existence in a place of such affluence. It's offensive to us. But his point is, if you don't allow people to start with nothing, they'll never get to something. Yes, you can subsidize rent, and we can put people in rent and have them be rent slaves the rest of their lives. Yes, you can subsidize mortgages and get people into homes they can't afford to maintain. Yes, there are all kinds of things we can do to induce certain styles of development that we can convince ourselves are going to be more compassionate to poor people. If we don't lower the bar of entry, we're not allowing people, we're not recognizing where people are and giving them that first foothold they need. And really, when you think about what California is in the ethos of America, California in the ethos of America is the place to go for opportunity. It is the place to go to get a fresh start. It is the place to go to start from the bottom and work your way up. When it comes to housing, we have to lower the bar of entry. Here's the other big concept. And this goes right to the build all at once to a finished state. We have to accept, I think, the rational response of humans in our cities to resist change. Because when you look at the type of change that we've subjected most neighborhoods to, it's not the type of change most of us would want to live with. But we have to reject the notion that no place will ever change. Every neighborhood in this state needs to be subjected to incremental amounts of change. No neighborhood should experience radical change, but no neighborhood can be exempt from change. We have to allow our places at the very fractal level, at the very block level, to iteratively change, evolve, grow, become something new. When you look at natural ecosystems, when you look at habitats, what you see at the fractal level is ongoing, continuous, incremental change. We have decided that human habitat is a stasis. It is a situation locked in amber. That is not natural. Our places have to be able to evolve, to change, to adapt. And if we can allow this to happen, if we can allow that block level, that micro change to take place, what we'll see from a true public engagement standpoint is that our people will show us what needs to happen. Our people who are innovative, who are thoughtful, who are opportunistic, who can create beautiful things, will have an opportunity to do so. I'm hesitant to show this now because you said the Manhattanize. The feedback that I get the most often when I talk about incremental development and having cities be built incrementally and that we need to embrace incremental change. We don't overwhelm and flood places, but they do have to evolve, is that, well, Chuck, this is California. We have huge problems. We're trying to solve global climate change. We're trying to solve housing issues. We're trying to solve poverty. We're trying to fix all these grand problems. We have to work big. We cannot accomplish anything big working incrementally. And I'm not suggesting that you should turn into Manhattan, but I am suggesting that when you look at this street and say we can't do anything big incrementally, you don't understand incremental development. Everything that we've ever done big, that was enduring and successful, was the culmination of lots and lots of incremental change. We can't do it the other way around, not and have it be successful. Thank you so much for having me here today.